would like to speak in this new lecture on French astrology on the certain tendency of French astrologers to reform astrology by just renewing the formulation of the old structures that we call to put old verses in old boxes or old recipients. Let's take the example of Jean-Pierre Nicolas. Jean-Pierre Nicolas published his works in the 60s, preserves the general structure of astrology, of traditional astrology. It keeps the planets, it keeps the houses, it keeps the aspects, it keeps the chart, it keeps signs, but he formulates all those things differently. The only thing which he didn't want to keep was the rulerships. Probably because he felt that rulerships were not based on sane, pure astronomy, which was more or less his motto. So, it is true that he did not accept the directions and progressions of any sort that Rudyard would have accepted. But finally, he took as granted the different compartments, the different categories of astrology. The only thing is that he made the effort to reformulate them. And it's the same with Patrice Guinard, who was a disciple of Nicolas and who is now at the head of, since 1999 or something, at the head of the Cura. And finally, this is the same program of work. And myself, when I was very young, I was more or less marked, influenced by this trend and this approach. That is, let us keep things, but let us formulate them differently. It has a sense, everything has a meaning, has a reason to be like that, but let's refresh it. I belong to another line of research, or at least it is now the case, for a rather long time already. That is, I don't think it's necessary to keep all these things. I don't think necessarily, as you probably know, that I do not accept all the planets, but only Saturn. And this is something which Nicolas or Guinard would never have imagined to do. I don't think that aspects are something you can use in psychology or in the chart, for the good reason that I do not accept the chart at all. I believe that aspects are only useful for prediction, to indicate a process, a period of time which is appearing or disappearing. Not in the case of connecting elements of factors within the chart for any psychological purpose. So I do not have to redefine aspects. I don't think that, of course, square are bad or something like that. But this is also something which has been reformulated by other astrologers. Although, finally, I see that most astrologers still continue to stick to this division of bad and wrong, because it finally it is what people want. It is essential, this problem of bad aspect. Bad is something we have learned to avoid. Good is not so important, but bad is important. When we feel something, when we feel sick, it's bad. We have to be aware of that and to take precautions against that. If a fruit, we don't like the fruit, it's bad, and we have to stop eating the fruit, etc. So bad is an indication that we have to stop with it. Good is just something which might sometimes produce a mistake, produce an error of judgment. You put a little of good upon the bad thing, and you think it's good. Okay, so this is a false duality in a way. But I won't insist on that. Structuralism in France has produced this attitude that I was criticizing just before. That is, we take everything as granted, but we change it a little. We reform it, we reformulate it. And in fact, we could say that historical reform becomes an historical reformulation, which is not exactly the same. Those people like Nicolas and Guinard didn't have the courage to say, well, we don't have to take all the planets because it's not useful, it's not productive. Why should we embarrass ourselves with all those planets? Why should we embarrass ourselves with this chart? This chart is composed of all these planets. And of course, if you only take one planet, there is no reason for you to keep the chart. So accepting all the planets and accepting the chart goes together in a way. And you will and aspects also are which will connect all the planets together. So this is a vicious circle. You take one thing, you have to take another thing, etc. But on rulerships, I already made a lecture on that. It's very interesting, and actually Guinard has not refused or rejected rulership as Nicolas did. But rulerships have to be reformed, like Pisamo-Foucault understood that. Has to be changed, special exaltations, etc. But finally, although I worked a lot on that field of rulerships, it doesn't mean that I will finally accept rulerships in my work, in my practical work. Working on rulerships is in fact an historical action. You want to understand why astrology has created that and how was it created at first. But it doesn't mean that you have to accept it. And you have to make a difference between an historical approach and a critical approach. As an historian, I like to understand what the system is. Like Boucher-Leclerc said in 1899 in Astrology Grec, we do not lose time by understanding why people lost their time. And okay, so we have to be, in many cases today, history of astrology is invading the historical work. And from this point of view, history of astrology has done great harm to astrology, to historical research. I think about Yves Lenor, for instance, who has been very much involved in history of astrology, but it has finally contaminated his work, his practical work, which is a different story. We have to say, well, okay, we understand that astrology has done that and that and that, and that is one thing, but we understand astrology should be something else. There is here a dilemma, because in a way, they would say, well, but if history of astrology says that, that means astrology was originally that. That is not necessarily the case. We can perfectly imagine that what we call the history of astrology doesn't mean the origin of astrology, but it means a certain stage of development of astrology, which is a different story. So, what we call history of astrology today is not original astrology. It is already a later period. And I have explained that later on, previously. I explained my method how to reconstitute former stages of astrology. I said, for instance, that at the beginning it has to be very simple, very coherent, and very useful. I have a pragmatical approach of astrology, if I can say so. I always think, what did society expect from astrology? Or preferably, what sort of astrology did they want to create? For what purpose? For what need? And that makes a difference. Because it is I would call it an anthropological approach of astrology. A sociological approach. What for? And I used to say that astrology is not the science, it is not the study of the stars, it is a law based on the stars, which is different. A law which is using the stars as a reference, as a process, but in the limits of its needs, not just as a whole. If I need to fix, for instance, a time for elections of the president, I will have to stick to one solution among thousands. I cannot elect people every day. That is to be practical. From this point of view, I am a practical astrologer. I want to know what it is, what astrology is for. And I've reached a conclusion that astrology initially only needed one planet and one planet only, whatever it is. And in many cases, you can see that this line exists. For instance, if we consider the 12 signs, the 12 sun signs, what is it? It's one planet, that is the sun here, which circulates through the ecliptic, through the zodiac, and which will point at a certain moment a certain sign. It's not two planets, it is one planet. In many other approaches in predictive astrology, you have one factor which is circulating, and I think that is what Rudyard says. You have one factor circulating at a certain rhythm throughout all the houses of the chart, according to a certain rhythm, a certain rapidity. You know, that means that people understand that at a certain point you need one factor, and the diversity is not at the level of the number of factors you use, but at the number of factors which this specific factor would cross one after the other. Diversity is not a question of number of planets, but number of sections, number of signs, number of stages. And there is a big confusion about that. Nicolas has not understood that, in fact, although he developed a very interesting theory about ages, we call it the theory of ages, which is very interesting, but he has not really understood the interest of this theory. It's just a fact, which is not new, because we find it in Ptolemy, etc., that each planet corresponds to a certain age of life. Mercury, and the quicker a planet is, the youngest the age is. So, we have the age of Mercury, of Venus, of Mars, of Jupiter, of Saturn, etc. So that proves that these planets names of planets, they are not planets, they are just ages, stages, and stages which receive names of planets, or more clearly, the names of gods. Gods were used to illustrate the different ages of life. And it's only in a second stage that they were associated with planets. At first, they were just associated as an illustration, a graphic illustration. And it was not necessarily included within astrology that you should consider the cycle of each of these planets. It was just a blackboard, just a clock. Okay? And there was a shift. There are many shifts which occurred in the history of astrology with rather negative effects. There was a shift which realized, which produced this importance given to the planets in astrology, to all the planets. And that was quite a mistake. For instance, Guinard, who passed a doctorate in 1993 on astrology and philosophy, which is not exactly the title, but it is it. It was a thesis in philosophy, but connected with astrology, did not understand that if you associate a concept, a notion, to a planet, and not just to a division of time, you will produce things which have no meaning, which are nonsense. If you say, for instance, Mars and Venus are two planets, instead of saying they are two concepts, two times, there will be a time where you will have a conjunction of Mars and Venus, which will be absurd, because Mars and Venus are concerned by two different levels, two different sections, and they by no means can be at the same place, at the same time. This is one aspect that Guinard has not understood, that you cannot pass from astrology to philosophy like that, or you cannot pass from philosophy to astronomy. So, we are defending, advocating the idea of a primer astrology, original primitive astrology, which might not have left very much traces, very much prints, but which has existed, which we can reconstitute according to a pattern of what is a normal evolution. History by itself is insufficient. It needs to be based on sane anthropological structures and processes and dialectics. And this is what French historians understood in the 30s with Marc Bloch, for instance. History needs to use demography, to use meteorology, to use social sciences, and history of astrology needs that sort of thing. So as an historian, before I was an historian of Middle Ages, of Renaissance, and later periods. And even for these periods, there were a lot of problems, especially about Nostradamus, as you probably know. But finally, I developed a great interest for the prehistory of astrology, if you can say that, for the first stages of astrology. And I have a new prospect of history of astrology, where what they call history of astrology is only a limited time in the history of astrology. The knowledge history of astrology doesn't recover the phenomenon of the history of astrology as a process, as a general process. It's very important to circulate throughout the past in history, and you cannot not only rely on what has been kept. An example of this necessity of understanding that not everything has been kept is the genesis, the history of the zodiac. For instance, I developed recently, a theory, which is more than a theory actually, about the origins of the zodiac. And I said the origin of the zodiac is taken from the illustrations we find in the almanac, in the books of hours. These books have a specific illustration for each month of the year, about the activities that men develop during each month. For instance, in winter, people stay inside and they warm themselves by the fire. So I said, for instance, that Aquarius is an extract from a scene that you can find in these books, especially in one of my favorites, which is the Très riche heures du Duc de Berry. It was created during the 100 Years' War in the 14th, 15th century by the Duc de Berry. And I say, well, you see this glass, this bottle, this carafe that corresponds to Aquarius, is just a part of a scene where there are people sitting around a table and eating and drinking, and that's just an element of this scene. Just to come from this scene. As a matter of fact, you can find it also in the first card of the tarot, the battler, juggler. You have also this sort of table where you can find a knife, a spoon, and a sort of glass. And they told me, well, you know, Mr. Halbronn, Dr. Halbronn, you know, we have no traces of these illustrations. Zodiac is older than those monthly illustrations. Yes, you have it in almanacs. Yes, you have it in the decorations of the cathedrals, but it hasn't been kept for the antiquity. So if it hasn't been kept for the former period, we cannot accept the idea that they were the sources of the signs. This is absurd. It's obvious for a sane mind that the signs of the zodiac are coming from this sort of images. And even if those images haven't been kept, it doesn't make any difference. They have existed. It has been transmitted, it has been, for instance, in the history of literature, of text, we have many cases like that, of books which have only been kept through translations, in Syriac, in Arabic, in Hebrew, etc. But obviously they were not created at this moment. They were older, maybe even the older version has disappeared. It has remained in the expressions of a translation or even of critical books against these books, etc. So you cannot have a naive approach of history, as you cannot have a naive approach of science. It's not because astronomy has developed and discovered so many points, so many planets, and stars, but astrology has necessarily the duty to exploit this information and to introduce this information in its own work, in its own way of working. It's absurd. Here also you cannot be too naive. It's true that astronomy is at the source of astrology in many ways. But it doesn't make any. It's like saying that French, coming from Latin, we have to return to Latin. It's ridiculous. They don't understand that the history of mankind is made of choices. You take from a whole a part of it, and you don't use everything because you don't need it. If you go to eat in a restaurant, you don't eat all what is on the chart, on the map. You don't eat everything what they have prepared. You only say, well, give me this and this and this. You don't say, give me all. If you go to buy a medicine, you don't buy all what is in store. You never buy everything which is in store in any case. If you want a shirt, you don't buy all the shirts. If you want a shoe, you don't buy all the shoes. If you want a planet, you don't take all the planets. So, this is what I wanted to tell you for this lecture. Probably the next one, soon or later. Bye.